I'd like to welcome all of you to the Spiritual Conversation workshop presented by Lutheran Hour Ministries. This is the first of two workshops in which we'll be taking a closer look at the types of conversations we have in our everyday life. In particular, our spiritual conversations. In this first workshop, we're going to be looking at what we call the eager conversationalist. In particular, I've got a couple of goals for our time together. The main one is that by the end of this presentation, you will aspire to invest time and energy into talking about the faith. I want you to want to talk about your faith. I want it to feel natural, to feel normal. For some of you, that's going to be real easy, in which case I want you to want to grow in that. For some of you, you might be thinking, well, that's kind of scary. Well, that's okay. You're not alone. As we'll see with some of the research we've uncovered, there are a lot of people who have a hard time doing this. I want to help you grow in that and start the process of making that a natural, comfortable thing. We're going to do that by doing a couple of things in particular. We're going to talk about something that we call the eager profile. More about that coming up. We're going to get a chance for you to take that eager profile and actually find out what we're calling your eager score. You're then going to acknowledge the value of spiritual conversations in your life. We'll also affirm your need to grow in a specific area. You're going to evaluate your strengths and weaknesses, and then finally develop a plan. Now, before we can do any of this, though, there's a basic question hiding just in the background, and that question is, what in the world do we mean by a spiritual conversation? Well, let's watch this video and start to answer that.
What are spiritual conversations? And do I really need to be having them? When I hear the word spiritual conversations, the first thing I think of is evangelism. And a cold terror fills my heart. It calls to mind images of door-to-door calling, pastors proclaiming the gospel on street corners, and hours locked away memorizing speeches and outlines. That is not for me. That's not what my faith is all about. My faith is something personal. It's something I keep to myself and don't often talk about with others. Yet, the Bible presents me with a very different picture. It shows me a picture of a faith that was never meant to be put in a box, only to be brought out for worship services and special holidays. Instead, the Bible paints a picture of something that is so central to my life, it flows naturally out of everything I do. And then I step back and look at my own life and realize I'm only wondering about all of this because the spiritual conversations didn't stop with the writing of the Bible. People spread throughout the world, meeting people, inviting people, and telling them the good news. Fathers told their daughters, mothers told their sons. Centuries went by and the conversations kept going until here I am, wondering what even counts as a spiritual conversation. Because I'm starting to think that maybe, just maybe, I'm supposed to be having them.
So what is a spiritual conversation? A spiritual conversation, and when we talk about this today, this is what we mean by the term, is any conversation that you have with anybody about God, spirituality, faith, or even the lack of faith. Even a conversation about doubt counts. And this is with anybody. So yes, this could be a conversation with a non-Christian. This could be your non-Christian friend or someone like that. But it also counts if it's your spouse. It counts if it's your pastor. It counts if it's your child. It counts if it's your friend from college who says, these are the reasons why I don't believe. All of those things counted in this research as a spiritual conversation. It's a very broad term that doesn't have any baggage in it. So with that in mind, I have a question for each of you. It's a question that we began to wonder here at Lutheran Hour. How many conversations are people having about faith or the lack of faith with anybody in the past year? Now, before I go on and tell you how people across the country answered this, I want you to answer this. Take a moment right now and answer it honestly for yourself. I'm not going to ask you to tell anybody, share this number with anybody, but I want a number. How many conversations have you had about the faith or the lack of faith with anybody in the last year? My friend Don says to me that he runs into people when he talks about this all the time who go, I can't give you an actual number. How would I do that? How do I figure out that number? Well, guesstimate then. But make an actual guesstimate. And I want you to write it down somewhere. You don't have to share it with somebody. And if you have to, say, well, I have probably 50 conversations a day, multiply that by 7 days a week, by 52 weeks a year, and you've got a pretty close number. Or maybe you're thinking, I don't know, maybe I have one a month. Okay, well, multiply that by 12, and you've got a number. Whatever it is, I want you to actually write it down. Not for me, but for you. Write it down. A couple of you are doing calculus right now. For those of you, that's okay. You can keep doing the calculus. For the rest of us who are kind of done with that number, look at it for a moment. And I have a question for you to just start to reflect on. How do you feel about that number? What's its emotional weight for you? Do you like it? Do you think, oh, that's exactly where I'd kind of like it to be? Do you look at it and think, that's kind of small? Or do you look at it and think, oh, wow, this is a bigger part of my life than I thought it was. I'm doing this a lot more than I had ever really noticed. How do you feel about that number? I'm going to come back to that question in a little while. But before I do, I want to back up a little bit. This all started with a relationship that Lutheran Hour Ministries has with the Barna Group, a research group. We began to wonder if our ministry is to bring Christ to the nations and the nations to the church. We started to ask ourselves, you know what, we need to take a closer look at what's going on in the world, all across the world, but also here in America. And in order to do that, we decided to go ahead and partner with the Barna Group and begin to do some research on what's going on in culture in America. And they're the experts in this sort of thing. So we started with this first monograph, this first research study, Spiritual Conversations in the Digital Age. It came out in 2018. It's the first of a series of studies that we're doing. And the research you're going to be seeing and the presentations today that we're going through in these workshops all stems from this research that we did. And this first one started with this basic question. How many conversations are people having at all about the faith? And we asked a whole lot of follow-ups. Now, what's interesting about this is we asked this of the general American population. So we have some good statistics on what Americans in general are doing. But because the Barna Group is really thorough, we're also able to take a look at specifically how Christians look at this. One of the things we found out is that it turns out that in general, Americans aren't having many spiritual conversations. They report 77% of Americans report having less than 10 spiritual conversations in a year. And that really shocked me when I saw that data. I thought, that can't be right. With spiritual conversations being so broad, we're not just talking about Jesus here. We're not just talking about the Bible. I'm talking about faith or even the lack of faith. So two atheists get together at a bar one night and they're having a conversation and they're talking about how stupid it is to believe in God. That counts as a spiritual conversation. In general, 77% of Americans aren't even doing that. Now, you would think that the church would look radically different than this, but it turns out they're not. When we looked specifically at self-identified Christians, what we found was that in general, Christians aren't doing much better. As a matter of fact, it turns out that 73%, it was 77% of Americans, and for self-identified Christians, people who say, who made a list of criteria to say, I am a Christian, this is my core identity, this is important to who I am, 73% of them are having less than 10 in a year. That's less than one a month. The actual breakdown you can see right up here, you've got 32% of self-identified Christians having one or two conversations in a year. You've got 21% having 3 to 5. 9%, not of just Americans, but of self-identified Christians saying, I have 0. And then you have a group here who are having significantly more conversations. So what we found is that in general, we can break people up, Christians up into two kind of categories, what we called reluctant conversationalists. These are people who are having less than 10 spiritual conversations a year. And eager conversationalists. These are people who are having significantly more conversations a year. At least 10, but often a lot more. You saw on the last slide, sometimes up to 50 or more conversations a year. And in general, when we took a closer look, we found that for those eager conversationalists, there tends to be this kind of on or off switch with your faith. That there tends to be this, you're either kind of feeling more reluctant or you're all in. And it's not uncommon to have eager conversationalists who are reporting, I don't know how to calculate this number. It's really, really high. I talk about my faith all the time. Now, for us at Lutheran Hour Ministries, one of the things that occurred to us immediately is, if we're not even comfortable talking about our faith at all with anybody, with people we agree with, then is it any wonder that we're afraid to actually go out and share the good news with those who don't agree with us? Now, before we could go any further, though, we had to stop and kind of check our thinking and ask ourselves a question. Should we be having spiritual conversations? As Christians, is this actually a biblical idea or just some idea that we're kind of coming up with? And what we ended up deciding is, yeah, it's actually pretty integral to who we are as Christians. So I want to start here looking a little deeper at that by taking a look at the Bible for a moment.
I read the Old Testament and see that God's people were called to have faith so constantly on their hearts and minds that it naturally became something they would teach diligently to their children and to talk about when they sat in their houses and when they walked by the way and when they lied down and when they rose. Holidays weren't just an opportunity for families to gather and celebrate. They were also an opportunities for families to have spiritual conversations, to retell the story of their faith together. Everyday objects became memorials, a chance to pause during the work of the day and tell of the faithfulness of God in the life of His people. And while the faith at times spread through grandiose encounters with prophets, angels, and even God Himself, more often it was the everyday conversations after these encounters that had the biggest impact.
You read the Old Testament and you see that spiritual conversations are everywhere. You don't see a whole lot of explicit, make sure you have 5 of them today. They're implicit. They're a part of the narrative. They're a part of the structure of life. In Deuteronomy, we're told to remember that the Lord your God is one. But then they go on to say, make sure you talk about this all the time. Talk about it with your children. Talk about it in the morning. Talk about it when you sit down to eat. Talk about it when you walk along the way. In the Old Testament, you saw holidays like Passover were centered in having spiritual conversations. What happened? People gathered together and they relived the story of the faith. They told the story again before they started eating the food. The excuse for having the food was also an excuse to celebrate what God has done and to retell the story. You may have noticed the rocks there, hey, Dad, what's the story about the rock? If you don't get that reference, it's a reference to Joshua. The book of Joshua. In the book of Joshua, when they cross through the river to get to the promised land finally, the water parts again. We usually think of the Red Sea parting as that being the big parting with Moses leaving in the Exodus. That happens. But God was kind of in the habit of parting seas to make room for His people. And when it happens again in the book of Joshua to go into the promised land, they go in and they get finally, they're there, right? They're on the doorstep. And God says, oh, wait, I'm not done. Before I close the waters, go back into the waters, grab some rocks, pull them out, and put them up. I want 12, one for each tribe. I want you to be there. I want them to be right there. And when people say, when your kids say in generations to come, hey, Dad, why is there a big weird rock next to the water? That's your excuse to say, because God protected us and brought us to this land. Let me tell you a good story, son. See, spiritual conversations are everywhere in the Old Testament. They're the fabric of daily life. And that doesn't change in the New Testament. The idea that you're going to talk about your faith is everywhere. From the very beginning of the Gospels all the way through Revelation, it's happening. If you just follow Jesus' ministry, how much of it's happening, not through miracles, but through everyday conversations? Maybe it's a man sneaking over at night to have a conversation with Jesus. And what do we get out of that? John 3:16. Maybe it's a woman at a well who goes in the middle of the day when no one else would go in the heat because she would be ostracized by her people, and meets Jesus. And he starts by just having a conversation. Maybe it's a tax collector or a sinner that Jesus comes over to their house and eats dinner with them and talks with them. All throughout his ministry, Jesus is having spiritual conversations. Maybe it's the disciples. Maybe it's Peter. Maybe it's them walking along the way and him taking time to explain what's going on in the faith. And of course, this doesn't end with Jesus. No, he dies on the cross, he resurrects on Easter morning, he ascends into heaven, and the disciples are sent out, and they hide at first, right? And what are they doing as they're hiding? They're talking about Jesus. They're waiting for the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit comes, and what's the first thing they do? Peter runs out and starts talking about Jesus. And then what do they all do? When the world comes and says, listen, if you keep talking about Jesus, we're going to kill you. Stephen says, well, then pick up your stones and stone me. And he talks and he shares. And the church spreads this way. We watch in the book of Acts, whether it be with believers sharing or whether it be people who are going to become believers. Christians are put in prison and they don't stop talking. Instead, they're telling the jailers about it. The spiritual conversations never come to an end. At one point, Paul writes from prison. He says, this is so important that I'm going to keep talking about it no matter what. I'm not going to be ashamed about the gospel. He says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. From the very time God called people and said, you are my people, having conversations was natural to the fabric of who they were. So as we looked at all of this at Lutheran Hour, and we saw just how few spiritual conversations are happening right now in America, and just how important it is to who we are, we said, you know what? We need to do something about that. And in order to do that, we stopped and said, okay, well, what can we learn about those who are actually having a lot of conversations? We took a look at the reasons for being reluctant, and I'll talk a little bit more about those in a little while. But we really wanted to zero in on the positive things. What are the people who are eager, who are naturally doing this, who don't feel like this is a burden, but it's just a part of their way of life? What do they have in common? What do these eager conversations have in common? And what can we learn from them? And can we actually grow ourselves so that no matter where we are in the spectrum of eagerness, we can become a little more eager? So for the rest of our time today, that's what we're going to be focusing on what it means to be an eager conversationalist. But before I kind of present those things to you, what I want you to do is take a quick look at yourself. And so in front of you, you have a folder, a binder in front of you, and there is an inventory. It should be in the left-hand pocket, the front page. It's the Eager Profile Inventory. And I'm going to give us a few minutes right now to do this. And I know you don't necessarily know what any of this stuff means yet. That's okay. I'm going to explain it all to you in a little while. I want you to just have your first gut reactions to this. Now, the way you're going to take this is you're going to go through and you're going to see this is part of the inventory right here that's filled out for pretend, and you're going to see some statements. The first one is, I believe everyone needs their sins forgiven, and you're going to choose one of the answers. That's a statement that you think is not at all like me, not like me, someone like me, just like me. Now, for many of us who've grown up in the church, you may feel like you immediately know what the right answer is supposed to be. I want to stress that I'm not going to make you share this with anyone. This is a self-evaluation tool. If you want to lie on it, hey, I will never know, and the only person you're really lying to is yourself. This is for you. I want you to have a way of kind of looking at yourself a little bit. So be honest. In this example, the person says 3. I believe everyone needs their sins forgiven. And so there's something going on in their head where maybe they don't always feel that way. They know they're supposed to, but they don't. And so they're being honest with themselves. The next one, I believe forgiveness only comes through death and resurrection of Jesus. They gave themselves a 4. I trust in Jesus for eternal life. They gave themselves a 3. When I think about who I am, I see my primary identity as a child of God. They gave themselves a 2. I'm quick to forgive others, a 1. Then they brought their scores all the way down, and they totaled them up to have an E score there on the bottom. Once you've done that, if you turn to the back of that inventory, you'll see there's an E, A, G, E, R, and you go ahead and take that E score, that first E, and you'd put it right here, 13. So I'm going to give you about 5 minutes or as long as we need to go ahead and take that inventory. I'll be walking around if you have any questions for me. Don't overthink this. Just go with your gut reaction. This doesn't have to be your final answer. As I'm talking later, I'm going to give you the opportunity to make some changes. So feel free to do the gut reaction. I see there's a couple of people still kind of putting their last numbers down. That's okay. You can do that while I'm going to go ahead and get started here and keep going. So this EAGER is an abbreviation, eager, for the big categories of what we found about eager conversationalists and what they have in common. In particular, there are 5 things, and there is a list of things that go under each of these, and we're going to take a closer look at them here in just a moment. But eager conversationalists do 5 things. They embrace the gospel, they apply spiritual disciplines, they grasp the calling, they expect spiritual conversations to happen, and they respond confidently. And people who are stronger in these 5 things are more likely, there's a correlation between that and being more comfortable, more natural, more willing, and and definitely will have more spiritual conversations. So what I'm going to do now over the next period of time is I want to go through each of these categories and tell you a little bit more about what the research found and what it means for us. And what I want you to do is I want you to have that inventory right in front of you. I'm going to go through each category. And as I go through these things, if your understanding of that category changes, if your understanding of yourself changes because of that, I want you to feel willing to change your answer on this sheet. You might have said, I'm giving myself all 1s, and then the lowest score on an area. And then as I talk about it, you go, well, I was a little harsh on myself. Actually, I should be a little more, raise myself up. On the other hand, you may have taken it for granted that, well, I'm a Christian, so it should be all 4s for this. And then as we talk about it, you might think, well, actually, this particular one is one I'm weak on. Well, then change the score. This is a self-evaluation tool. I want you to have a chance to look at yourself. And that's all this is trying to help you do. So your score's not locked in forever. Make the change as I'm talking. You'll also notice in your binder there's a note sheet right behind the inventory that has the EAGER on it. And if you want just some place to jot down some notes as I'm talking, it's on the left-hand side again. I see some of you going, oh, there's a lot of sheets in here. Yeah, some of them are for the next session. We'll get to those later. So as we begin, let's start with the first one, embrace the gospel. Eager conversationalists are people who have a clear and certain understanding that salvation comes from belief in Jesus Christ alone, and forgiveness of sins comes only through the death and resurrection of Jesus. Now that one might seem a little simplistic to you. You might be thinking, well, that's kind of axiomatic to being a Christian, right? That's obvious. If you're a Christian, you believe that statement. In theory, yes. But some interesting things came out for us in the research. One is that actually, when it comes to these statements, we can't take them for granted in 21st century America. When the research asked a whole lot of questions, not just this question about how many spiritual conversations you think you had, but there's a whole lot of other data that came to us. And one of these points of data that's particularly interesting has to do with this question of everyone needs to have their sins forgiven. Reluctant conversationalists, only 41% of self-identified Christians, this is not the general population, this is just for those who say, I'm a Christian, only 41% of the reluctant conversationalists agreed with that statement. So maybe one reason they're reluctant is they don't see what's at stake, that everyone needs their sins are forgiven. If they don't think this is actually important for everybody, well, of course you're not going to talk about it with everybody. It just kind of makes some sense. The thing that I think is even scarier for me is that 68% of the eager conversationalists agreed with that. So it's not as though the eager conversationalists are in this camp of like perfect agreement with this statement. There's room to grow and become more eager, even for the eager conversationalists. But you're significantly more likely to be talking about your faith if you agree with that statement. Another example, the Bible is totally accurate in all the principles it teaches. Reluctant conversationalists, only 36% agreed. Eager conversationalists, 62% agreed. So you're significantly more likely to be talking about your faith if you believe that. Another example here, in the eager conversationalists versus reluctant conversationalists, in their view of life after death. As you can see, the eager conversationalists are significantly more likely to have what we would consider a more orthodox view of life after death, of heaven, of hell, of things of that nature. Now, in particular, when we looked at eager conversationalists, there were 5 things that we saw a correlation between. There are other things we could say about what it means to embrace the gospel. These are the things we're saying that if you grow in this, you're more likely to talk about your faith, and we have data to show that. The first one, I believe everyone needs their sins forgiven. The second, I believe forgiveness only comes through the death and resurrection of Jesus. Again, we start to think these things are obvious. But think about the people in your life. Do you know people who would call themselves Christian that don't agree with this? I have a friend who was a pastor, and when he went to his first call a number of years ago, he went to a congregation. It was a smaller congregation, and it had some rough stuff that it was going through from previous experiences that had happened. And the one person that my friend was really leaning on was the president of the congregation. It was someone who was there for him. He was a rock. And they would get together for breakfast every single week. And one week as they're talking and he's getting counsel from this guy and wisdom from all his years of experience, the guy suddenly says, I'm just so thankful that Jesus died for everyone's sins so that no matter what you believe in, you're guaranteed to go to heaven. And my friend, the pastor, went, wait, what did you just say? He's like, well, it doesn't matter if you believe in Allah or Buddha or nothing at all. Jesus died for your sins. And my friend was like, well, yeah, but forgiveness comes only through Christ. He's like, well, no, everyone's going to heaven. And my friend realized all of a sudden, wow, this guy who's been a pillar of this Christian community is missing something fundamental to Orthodox Christianity. Something hugely important. How did this happen? I wish that story was an anomaly. But I run into this sort of thing all the time. In my own ministry, I can think of a time where there was someone that I had that was just kind of like that. I had a very similar relationship in this church, where he had been a prominent member of the congregation. He was supportive in all these ways. He was active in Bible study. He was active in ministry. And suddenly this individual, I'll call him Jimmy John just to give him a name. Suddenly this individual, Jimmy John, went through a major health crisis. And he was in the hospital, and I got called by his wife to come to the hospital and to visit with Jimmy John right before we went into surgery. And we didn't know what was going to happen after the surgery. We didn't know that this was going to work out. And we're sitting there, and we're praying, and we're talking. And Jimmy John looks at me and says, I just hope I've done enough. And I didn't know what he meant at first. I said, Jimmy, what do you mean? He's like, well, I've tried so hard to earn God's love. I just hope I've done enough to get to heaven. And I looked at him and I said, Jimmy, you can't ever do enough. That's why Christ came. He's like, yeah, I know. But, I've been, and he starts listing the things, and I had this moment where my heart sank, and I thought, how is it possible? Week after week, he's been in the pews hearing me preach and others preach for longer than I'd been alive. Leading Bible studies, speaking the words himself, and yet somehow, in his own heart of hearts, he didn't actually know the gospel. This is a thing that happens. I see it from students at seminary preparing to be a pastor, where I'll get into a conversation with them and I'll realize they themselves are still struggling with the core of the gospel and who they are. We take it for granted that if you call yourself a Christian, you've figured out how to embrace the gospel, that you're not struggling with any of these things. And it turns out we can't take that for granted. It is the core of what we are about. And sometimes you can't even take it for granted in your own life, that you need to take a look at yourself. Personally, one thing that jumps out at me here always is the second to last one. When I think about who I am, I see my primary identity as a child of God. I think this is huge. I think this is something we struggle with a lot in America today as Christians. When you look in the mirror, what do you see looking back? Well, the world has all sorts of things for me to see. To see myself, my political identity, to see my gender identity, to see my racial identity. Is that the first thing you see? To see myself as fat, to see myself as thin, to see myself as rich, to see myself as poor, to see myself as fitting in with a particular group or forced to be in another group, as an outsider or an insider, to see my financial income, to see how well I'm providing for my family. Even for me, oops, I lost the slide I was on. Wonder where it went. And as a father, and if you know me personally, you know I'm really all in being a husband and a father. I just love it. Sometimes I just want to quit my job and go home and just hang out with my family all day and my kids. We'll just do homeschooling for the sheer fun of playing with my kids. But is that my primary identity? God would say no. He would look at you and say, I sent my son to die for you so that you might be an adopted child of me. God would look at you and say, I love you as my son or daughter, and nothing can change that. You are sealed in my promises to you. You're my child. And as Paul writes about so eloquently again and again and again, it means you get the full rights of inheritance as a child of God, the full citizenship. You're not a partial citizen. No. Fully in the family of God. That's your identity. And you know, when you see yourself that way, of course you talk about the faith all the time. It's who you are. It's going to come up with everyone, whether you want it to or not. It's going to be natural. The more you see yourself as a child of God, the more you'll talk about it. I think another one that's pretty interesting to me is I am quick to forgive others. The relationship between forgiveness and talking about your faith. And we live in a culture that I think doesn't even understand what forgiveness is anymore. People have to earn forgiveness. Well, if you actually understand the definition of the word forgiveness, you can't earn it, or it's not forgiveness. It's something else. Forgiveness is inherently something that cannot be earned. That's what makes it forgiveness. We live in a culture that says, well, maybe we shouldn't always be quick to forgive. But those who are can only really be that way because they understand they themselves have been forgiven. And that changes how they see themselves. It changes what they talk about. So before we move on, I challenge you to kind of think about your answers. I want you to take a brief moment. And is there an answer in the Embrace the Gospel section that you want to change? Is there an area here that you want to know more about? Do this. Circle one of them if there's something you're just curious about. Maybe you don't see yourself as being weak in it. That's fine. But you're like, I want to know more about this. Maybe it's you want to know more about how other people are struggling with this. Maybe you just want to learn how to talk about that area. Just one that you find yourself kind of interested in. Circle that number.